surprisingly, they're made up of a type 1 fiber. All right. The second type are FFR, which is fast fatigue resistant. All right. So they're fast, but they're fatigue resistant. So those are our type 2A fibers. And then the last one is FF, which is fast but fatigable. Right, so those are type 2Xs. And the other characteristic when you look at them is when you look at the size of the axon, the slow have the smallest, the FFRs are a little bit larger, and the FF are the largest axon. So the bigger the axon, the faster it can transmit the signal. Right. And we want a fast signal going to our fast switch fibers. Right. So then the number of fibers in a unit, the other thing to look at is that depends on how much control is required by that motor unit. So the finer the control has to be, the less muscle fibers are attached to that motor nerve. All right? So for example, in the eye, the muscles that move your eye have 5 to 10 muscle fibers per nerve. But when you look at those in your calf, they've got 1,000 muscle fibers per nerve, right? Because I don't have to have very fine control over my calf muscle contraction. On average, that textbook says, on average across the body, we're looking at about 100 muscle fibers per nerve. But clearly there's a big range there, depending on what the job of that nerve is likely to be. All right, so in order for the muscle to contract, we have to have a signal from the central nervous system that the nerve carries down to the muscle fiber. All right, so that electrical signal is called the action potential. Right? And that's going to travel down the nerve, across the synapse, and then across the surface of the muscle. So when there isn't an electrical signal, when there's no impulse being transmitted, then the potential across the membrane is called the RMP, the resting membrane potential. And at that point in time, you have a net negative ion charge on the inside of the cell and a net positive ion charge on the outside of the cell. And the imbalance between the two is somewhere around minus 65 to minus 70 millivolts. If enough signals come down the nerve, then, and we reach threshold, remember we're going to sum all those signals, and if we reach threshold at the axon hillock, then the signal will continue down the axon. Right? So if we reach threshold, then we change this balance of charges across the membrane, and that causes the action potential. All right? So what happens if we reach threshold is that sodium channels open up and sodium enters the cell, right? And that's called depolarization. And so we change the balance, the charge across the membrane from minus 70 up to plus 30 in a very, very short period of time, just a couple of milliseconds. And then there's a little bit of a delay after the sodium channels have opened and the potassium channels then open, and the potassium can leave the cell. And so then we see the charge change, and it's called repolarization, and we bring the charge back down. So I think this is easiest to look at in the diagram. All right, so this is their diagram, this is the picture of what these channels look like. So to depolarize, I'm going to open the sodium channel, all right? And my potassium channel is shut. When I repolarize, we open the potassium channel and close the sodium channel. So that's mechanically, when we look at the electrical charge, makes a little more sense. Here's my resting membrane potential. All right, so on this diagram, they've set it at around -65. Okay. We open the gate, and the sodium goes across the membrane, and we see a big, very rapid change in the potential across the membrane. Right? Look at this timeline. Very rapid. And then we close the sodium and open the potassium, and we see it drop back down again. So we change the charge again. And actually, when we repolarize, it actually hyperpolarizes, so it goes even lower than it was at rest. And that's interesting because in order to come back to rest, what you see is what they call a sodium-potassium pump. And that pump is responsible for using a lot of ATP. Right? And the pump shifts 3 sodiums, which way around is it? Can we make sure I get that right? 3 sodiums out, 2 potassiums back in. We adjust the charge across the membrane just a little and bring it back to -65. So that's one action potential. And every time that occurs, it needs ATP, and those are coming down the nerve at a rapid speed all the time during a skill, right? You don't only contract the muscle once. What skill do we do where we only contract the muscle once, right? And basically nothing. So that's happening over and over and over again, very, very rapidly. Right? So remember that we've got an electrical signal down the motor neuron. Right, that's our action potential. When we get to either the synapse to another nerve, or in the motor system, the synapse with the muscle, so the neuromuscular junction, we have to turn that into a chemical message, and that's our neurotransmitter, our ACH. And then if enough acetylcholine attaches to the surface of the muscle, we're going to stimulate opening up the ion gate, and we'll see another electrical charge across the surface of the muscle. ACH is an excitatory neurotransmitter because it stimulates a depolarization in the muscle that causes contraction. There are neurotransmitters that are inhibitory rather than excitatory, and they prevent an electrical charge from occurring on the other side. So we don't get that in a motor nerve very often. Right? Usually we're looking at ACH being released. but sometimes I might want to inhibit a skill. Right? I might want to practice a forehand swing, but not swing really hard. Okay? So just think about how quick this is. Don't worry too much about the numbers. Get the picture. We go from a big minus number to a big plus number very, very quickly. It drops back down again. We have to use ATP to come back to rest. And then it's all going to happen again for the next wave of signals. So the speed at which I can send the signal down the motor nerve becomes pretty crucial, because if it took a long time for the action potential to travel down the motor neuron, then I would have a very big delay in the muscle response to a signal. Okay? But the phone away says put it away. So the faster I can transmit the signal, the better off I'm going to be. Okay? And myelin, remember we mentioned this myelin sheath. It's a glial cell. It's a fatty substance, wraps around the motor nerve. And it wraps in little chunks, so we've got gaps in between. All right? And so the gaps mean that we do, did I put the diagram up here now? The gaps mean that when I'm transmitting this electrical signal, it can actually jump, and that speeds it up. So if this is my nerve, and this is my myelin sheath. Okay. Then what we see is the signal comes down and it can jump from here to here. And that makes it faster. Okay. It's called saltatory, called saltatory conduction. So, myelin, this little gap in the myelin is called the node of Ranvier, right? Allows the action potential, the signal from the central nervous system, to travel faster down the motor nerve. Right? Good thing, because that lets us respond quicker to a stimulus that's coming in. If we don't have the myelination, so not on the motor nerve, but on other nerves in the nervous system, not all of them have a myelin sheath. So on a nerve that doesn't have a myelin sheath, I have to stimulate the next piece of nerve as we go along. So it just takes longer. That action potential has to travel from piece to piece to piece. So it also, if you come back here, the other good thing about saltatory conduction is it reduces how many action potentials I have to create down the nerve, and so it reduces how much ATP I have to use to transmit the signal. So it's energy conservation, and it rapidly increases the speed at which the signal can travel. All right? Very brief action potential. Don't want to get too hung up on all the chemistry. All right? Sodium, potassium, moving in and out. Which one's going in which direction? Big change in electrical charge across the membrane, and that creates the signal. So, then, when we're turning on these motor units to create movement, there are some rules that appear to be followed most of the time. Right? So the size principle means that motor units are recruited from the smallest to the largest. So we want to be able to regulate the number of motor units we turn on. We want to regulate the size of the motor unit. I don't want to turn on a motor unit that's going to create tons and tons of force for a very simple job. Okay? So the size of the neuron, right, small, larger, largest, when we look at the size principle, then that says that I'm going to turn on 1s first, then I'm going to turn on 2As if I need them, and then if I absolutely have to, I'm going to resort to turning on 2Xs. Okay. That's interesting because when we look at hypertrophy, when we look at growth in the size of the muscle, which is something some people are wanting to do, right? Some of the football players, if I'm a shot putter or a sumo wrestler, right? The bigger the muscles, the better off I am. So some of us want to train in a way that causes hypertrophy. Type 2 fibers have much more potential for hypertrophy than a type 1 fiber. All right? So, but the rule says we turn on the type 1 fiber first. And that's why, if you go jogging, do people who jog or people who run marathons have legs the size of someone who sprints?
No.
No. Right? Because people who jog and people who run marathons turn on type 1s. If I go to the weight room and I don't use very much weight and I do lots of repetitions, do I get big muscles? No, because a light weight doesn't stimulate turning on type 2s, it stimulates type 1s. So if I want to see growth in size, I would have to create a training program that's going to turn on type 2s. Does that make sense? The benefit to the size principle is that it delays fatigue, because it means that predominantly when I'm doing something, the first muscle fiber I'm going to use are type 1s that don't fatigue very quickly, that can contract over and over and over again for a long period of time. Right? So if I'm doing an endurance activity, I'm not going to bother contracting these unless I want to speed up, do a sprint, suddenly have to tackle a hill or a flight of stairs, or I want to sprint into the finish. So I get to use my most fatigue-resistant muscles and also activities for daily living, right? Sitting here, cleaning your teeth, cooking dinner, right? I don't want to be using type 2As and only be able to fry my egg for 30 seconds. I want to be able to cook for an hour. So I want to be able to use muscle fibers that can contract over and over and over. Right? So the size principle provides a lot of benefit to us because it means that I'm going to use the easiest to turn on because they're the smallest, and they're the most resistant to fatigue, so I can delay getting tired. However, sometimes recruiting these might not get the job done. So if I'm a sprinter and I'm at the beginning of the race and the gun goes off, and the size principle says I have to recruit type 1s, then type 2s, and then finally I can turn on my type 2X and go really quick, it takes me 5 seconds to get out of the blocks, which is no good, because everybody else has finished the flipping race by now, right? So, at times, the brain can override the rule and turn the type X on straight away. Okay? So, if the activity demands high force to be successful, there is a way of the nervous system overriding the rule. Okay? And that's one of the other things we see with training. We get better at overriding the rule and creating more power to get out of the block. You might see stories, sometimes there are media stories about a mum who accidentally drives over the baby, right? And jumps out the car and lifts the car up to get the baby out. Right? Well, if I had to turn on type 1s and then type 2As and then type 2X, the baby would be pretty flat by the time I got the car off the baby. Right? So we can go straight to type 2X under certain circumstances. Another rule is that we have all or none. So when a particular motor neuron reaches threshold, so if the summation, if all the signals coming into that motor nerve add up to threshold or above, that action potential will transmit down that motor nerve. And every single fiber that is attached to that nerve, that's synapsing with that nerve, will contract. So, all or none. All the fibers in the motor unit are activated, or none of the fibers in the motor unit are activated. There's either enough signal to stimulate acetylcholine, or there's not going to be. So that's a diagram that gives us this picture. Right? So at lower percentages of maximum force, I'm recruiting type 1 muscle fibers because I'm recruiting a slow motor unit. Okay. The more force I have to produce, initially I'm going to turn on FFRs, all right? So we've got some overlap here between an S and an FFR. Gets me up to around 70% or so, 75%. And then if I still need more force in order to complete the skill, then I'm going to turn on the last lot. Okay? Questions on that? It's a really clever system. Okay? So turn on as much force production as I need to achieve the job. All right, so what kinds of adaptations do we see in the nervous system? Right? We don't see the same number of adaptations that we do when we look at the muscular system in response to training, but there certainly is some adaptation within this system. So the first thing we see is that we have an increased contraction. Right? So I turn on more motor units at any one time, and I can turn them on faster. right? The brake coding is quicker. So that leads to faster activation of the muscle, more efficient activation, and a more efficient recruitment pattern is the most likely outcome of that happening. Right? So I turn on the right type and the right number of motor units to achieve the best outcome with training. Right? So we see also increased neural drive. So increased amounts of messaging coming down the nerve with training, right? And you'll notice that, is this color right? Yes, okay. They corrected the color. In the last book, this coloring was wrong. So if you take a beginner, someone who hasn't done any weight training, or someone who hasn't done any weight training recently in the last few years, right? And you start a resistance program or a weight training program with that person. And they come and they train with you, let's say week 1, they train 2 or 3 times. Week 2, they train 3 times. By the end of week 2 and going into week 3, you as the trainer are starting to have to up the amount of weight maybe, right? If they're consistent and they come 3 times a week, then it doesn't take very long before you have to up the weight for them. Have you seen that when you're in the weight room? Right? But if you've been training that person for 2 or 3 weeks and you've had to add 5 pounds to their lifts, did they get bigger in 2 or 3 weeks? Did their muscles suddenly go bing? No. So that's a bit odd, right? Because they're stronger, because I had to put more weight on the bar for them, but they didn't grow. They didn't get any bigger. The muscles didn't change in size. So how can they possibly be stronger if they didn't lay down more protein, contractile proteins, and make their muscles bigger? So what we see in the initial weeks of training is not a big increase in muscle size, because that takes several months before we start seeing increase in size. The increase in strength that we get is to do with changes that are going on in the neural system, in the nervous system. Right? So I'm becoming way more efficient at turning on the right type of motor units for the job. Or I'm turning on more motor units to achieve the same job. Remember our picture? Okay. Our cross-section. In our cross-section, we've got all those different muscle fibers. Okay. So, if I have a nerve that's turning on those 2, and another nerve that's turning on those 2, then when I'm a beginner, maybe I only activate that one. And over the first 3, 4, 5 weeks of training, what happens, why I can lift more weight, is now I turn on both of them. If I turn on more muscle fibers, I can create more force. Does that make sense? What? It's Friday. It's Friday. It's okay. All right. Okay, so My initial increases in strength then are to do with things that are going on in the nervous system and the communication between the nervous system and the muscular system, not because of the adaptations in the muscular system, because those take way, way longer. Another thing we see is that not only can I turn on more of them during the lift, but I can turn on more motor units at the same time. So that's called synchronization. So those motor units are going to fatigue quickly. I can't do lots of lifts over and over and over. And the recruitment patterns, do I turn on these two? Do I turn on another two? Do I turn on three on one lift? Right? Those recruitment patterns appear to change the more skilled you become at the job that you're practicing. That's if I'm looking at strength and power training. The picture's a little bit different when we look at endurance training. Because now what I want to do, if we go back to our picture, when I'm doing endurance work, right, the goal is to go for as long as possible. Right? So I want to go for as long as I can. So instead of seeing synchronicity that we see in the strength and power work, I can turn on more units at the same time and create more force. We see the reverse happen. We actually learn asynchronous recruitment. So let's say that now I have that. So now what we learn to do, fascinating, right? This is so cool. If I'm a skilled endurance athlete, if I do a lot of endurance training, asynchronous. So that means I turn on this one. And then this one does some work. And then I turn that one off, and I turn this one on. And that one does a little bit of work. And then I give that one a rest, and I turn this one on. And that one does a little bit of the work, because at any one time I don't need lots of force production if I'm doing endurance work. I need continual muscle contraction. Then I can turn that one off, I can turn this one back on again. So by learning to turn on the motor units asynchronously, it provides a little rest period for these other sets of muscle fibers within the activity. Which is so cool. How can you all be sitting down? I know it's Friday, but that is so cool. Right? So that's a very clever adaptation that we see. And then we also see some adaptation at the actual neuromuscular junction, the synapse between the motor nerve and the muscle fiber. All right, we mentioned earlier in the week that that was a site of possible fatigue. A possible site of fatigue. Right? So one of the things that we see happen there is that the little storage pockets that hold the acetylcholine, we see more of those develop. Right? So we have more acetylcholine available at the end of the motor nerve. And then what we see, because having the acetylcholine doesn't help us if it can't attach to the muscle fiber. So the other adaptation at the junction is that on the muscle surface we see more receptor sites develop. So that means that I can get to threshold in the muscle fiber, right, at this point, this transition here, if I've got more acetylcholine and I have more receptors on the muscle, I can transmit and initiate that action potential faster. So I can get the signal to the muscle and get the signal going across and get the muscle contraction occurring more efficiently. Right. So all of this just means, right, comes back to specificity of training. Right? My principle of specificity. We have to do the training that creates the adaptation that improves the performance that we want to see. Right? So the type of training that I do is going to dictate which and how many muscle fibers are activated at any one time. And which motor units I need to turn on is going to rely upon what's the exercise that I'm doing, what are the demands of the exercise, what are the biomechanical positions. So remember, at one point we were talking about the fact that we need the most overlap, most effective overlap position. So the most effective angle where I can create the best force may not be the angle I need for that skill. Right? So biomechanics is playing a role. I'm going to change the order of recruitment and the amount of recruitment if I'm doing strength and power work. I'm maybe going to decrease the amount of recruitment at any one time if I'm doing endurance work. And only the muscles that are activated by a motor nerve are doing any work at any one time. And you've got hundreds of muscles. Who's done AMP lately? How many muscles do we have?
Wow.
Oh! Sit up! Right? A lot. Okay, so, sorry?
342.
342?
Three.
Oh, I don't know. I realize. Okay, a lot. We don't want to turn on all the muscles at the same time, right? Wouldn't be very good. My head's twitching, my fingers are twitching, okay? So we've got this amazing system that allows us to very specifically turn on muscle fibers that are going to achieve the outcome of the job that we're trying to do.
Nice.
Monday
Review.
is a review session.